because when we look at performance management, we can't actually tie it to engagement. In fact, there's a lot of research that says for many people, performance management, the way that we're doing it today in the traditional sense of the word, is actually driving disengagement.
Yeah, we're doing the opposite. We're
doing the opposite.
We're micromanaging performance, and that bugs people.
So that's flaw number one, is this idea that we're thinking that this process that we're doing is actually having the outcome that we want and driving performance. And so we need to sort of step back and look at the whole process.
Okay, well, your flaw number two is nobody really opens up with the person who pokes them in the eye. If you're going to kick my butt, I'm not going to tell you what you're going to kick my butt over what I tell you. So I'm not going to tell you.
Well, traditional performance management typically has an annual review in the cycle, and maybe there's a mid-year touch base with the manager, but usually it all boils down to this one big meeting, right? That the employee maybe wrote a self-review, they're coming to the table, the manager's written a review, and they're supposed to sit down and have this career development, performance conversation all boiled in this, 60 minutes or whatever the time allocation has been set. Well, the problem with that is that any employee knows that coming into that meeting, I need to be at my best. I need to make the best case, because whatever the outcome of that meeting is, it's going to influence my promotion, the projects I get, my pay. There's all sorts of implications of this down the line. So I'm not coming to that meeting as an employee with a open mind and authentic, hey, I really want to have a great conversation about my career and my contributions and those types of things. You're really coming in to negotiate how you performed in order to drive those outcomes you need.
Or you're coming in just to get through it, right? Oh, God, it's performance review time. How do I get through this?
How do I get through this? And the manager is coming to the table oftentimes with their own agenda, because maybe they have a limited amount of budget. Maybe they only can make so many.
Yes.
Maybe they, So what happens is you have this meeting that becomes really a really unauthentic negotiation between two people trying to drive to some kind of outcome. And what gets lost in it is what we've really wanted this to be. We've lost the idea of how do we help people develop. We've lost the idea of how do we connect them to the organization. All that gets lost, and it becomes much more of a...
So what do you do instead of that?
Well, there's lots of things we can do instead of that. It's getting back to starting to think about what is it we're trying to accomplish. And that's one of the first questions we ask any client around performance management. What are you trying to do? Is this a development conversation? Is this truly just trying to assess someone's compensation or reward philosophy? Is this about helping them connect to the goals and strategy of the company? And so, we've got 3 goals of performance management. And the problem is we've tried to answer all 3 of those in this one meeting. So
each one could be done differently.
Exactly. So to me, that's why if you looked at the book cover, there's this knot on the front of it, and we say abandon the knotted solution. It's like start to pull it apart. What do we want to do? What are we trying to do? And then how would we solve for each of those things independently versus bundle it all in this one crazy meeting through this one.
It just doesn't get any agenda done. Okay. So nobody remembers the good work. So what do you mean by that?
Well, this is the sad, fatal flaw, right? That we as humans just tend to be negative. 65% of our descriptive words are negative words. We tend to remember the thing that the person did wrong. We don't tend to remember the thing that they did right. And in Western cultures, particularly, we were raised with the idea that the way you make someone better is you tell them what they did wrong. Which actually, if you read David Rock or any of the neuroscientists, will tell you, no, that's not actually how you make people perform better. You tell them what they did right and figure out how they can do more of that, or how they can build more capability around the skills and the strengths that they have.
Well, I know that in coaching, because I've coached a ton. I've coached for 15 years. The coaching part with sports is that you want to sandwich any negative with positives. So if you are going to get constructively negative, you need to make sure you're talking about 2-to-1 ratio, at least.
I heard, it's funny, the sports analogy, but I heard a great story in one of the presentations I was in the other day where one of the members of the audience shared a story about a coach where a kid wasn't really, it was basketball, and they really weren't performing very well, and they were hogging the ball, and they just weren't up to what they should be doing. And the coach pulled the the player off the side and said, look, you're too good of a player to be doing the things you're doing. And so when you say it in that manner, what you're doing is you're giving them the confidence that, hey, look, you have these capabilities and you're not using them to the best of your ability versus, saying, hey, you got to quit being such a jerk and,
you're this and that and you're bad and everybody, yeah.
Right.
And then, you come out of there feeling like you're the worst person on the planet.
Well, and here's the really, really sad thing about fatal flaw number 3 is even a lot of your strong performers leave the performance management process feeling badly.
Yeah, they feel like they're awful when actually they're superstar.
Yeah. And you talk to a lot of managers and they'll say, oh, that was, I gave them a great review. And you talk to the person, they're like, that was horrible.
Well, and don't you think that as somebody who is a superstar, if they hear a negative, that's all they hear?
Right.
Because they're so geared to perform and to please. A lot of people are, aimed at pleasing or really performing and shining. And so if they think they're not shining, it's just demoralizing.
They're your type A personalities, right? They want to be great. They want to be loved. And they can't, it's very difficult for them to absorb that feedback. And then the worst of all is if you get into organizations who are ranking people, because I always say, who's the only person that's going to leave a ranking process who's happy is going to be number 1.
Yeah, everybody else feels like crap.
Yeah, even number 2 is going to feel like crap, right? Like, why am I not number 1?
Doesn't that get back to competition though? That's the unhealthy competition.
Exactly.
And you have to rank different skill sets. Okay, we just got done talking about people having different roles. Well, why you're ranking things wrong? So such and such might be number 1 in this particular skill set, and the other person's number 1 in this skill set, but yet you're valuing different skills over different skills. I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, so we are not machines.
So we are not machines.
We're not a cog in a system. They used to talk with that language.
So this one really gets to this where we were going with this idea of ratings or rankings. The idea that we as humans can assess people and attribute a number to them and do that fairly is a complete fallacy. We can't. And part of that is that we are extremely biased as humans. We're biased for all different reasons, and we mean the best, but we like people that look more like us. We like people that do things the way we do. We may have a recency bias where, hey, you just did something recently that I loved, and so I like you right now. And the person who did something great for me 3 months ago, I've forgotten about. But there's all sorts of problems in that we're trying to assess the performance of somebody and do a fair rating. And one of them that you mentioned is huge, is that we're trying to often compare people who are doing completely different jobs. So I'm going to compare 10 people who are doing 10 different roles and come up with some rating or ranking system that I think is fair and equitable across that group. It's just humanly not possible. But yet we like it because it mechanizes. It feels like somehow we're creating a valid system because we're putting numbers to people, and that feels better for us.
You were creating this scientific system of BS. If the theory's bad, that's bad.
Right. There's a factor called the idiosyncratic effect, and what the idiosyncratic effect is, a researched, proven out theory, I guess, that if I was to rate you, Sarah, 60% or more of what I am attributing to you is about me. So it's sort of like when you have an easy grader versus the hard grading teacher, right? You're the same person, but because these teachers have different constructs and frameworks, they see you differently. And that's the problem. When you actually look at how we assess somebody's performance, in the end, only about 20-25% about it is really their performance, and the rest is all about other factors.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, and this relates to businesses where I get frustrated when I feel like I'm getting service from a business, but I feel like it's a McDonald's drive-through. It's a high-end, so, like a legal service or whatever, and they're putting me through a McDonald's drive-through. And it's more complicated than that. And I think it's the same thing. And when you start to mechanize everything in a company, people start feeling really devalued because they feel like they're just in some process, and you're shoving them through a McDonald's drive-through for everything.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing here. Performance management is about humans. It's a human process, and we've tried to mechanize it and take the humanity out of it, which is crazy. We need to put the humanity into it. And it's a little messy and it's never going to be perfect, but we just need to recognize that's what it is.
Okay, so let's move on to let me introduce you to your competition. Now play nice together.
Yeah, so this goes back to what you and I have already talked about, this idea of the internal competition. If we've created an organization that has a lot of that, then we lose all the things we're trying to drive around a collaborative culture and innovative culture and all of that.
You can't compete. You can't compete with the external because you're so busy competing with each other.
Yeah, and again, to that idea of authenticity, if you're telling your employees, look, we want this, collaborative, innovative environment, and oh, by the way, at the end of the year, we're going to stack rank you, they're going to look at you and say, you don't really want a collaborative, innovative environment.
Yeah, you're full of crap. And that's what happens. That's what happens so much is they talk out of one side of their mouth and then they do something else. And people start to read actions. And that's the problem, too, is you might have a really good management, some really good managers who really are authentic. And then you have a couple that are bad who mess it up. And so that's the challenge.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, your last one is we are not Pavlov's dog. I like that.
Well, and this gets into the idea of some of the core philosophies that we've been using to build performance management processes are not true. And so when we look at motivation, back to the first question you asked me, what motivates people, money is rarely the thing that is going to really drive someone's motivation. And particularly when it becomes something that is a merit increase that happens once a year. So I don't show up on Wednesday because I know in 7 months down the line, I'm going to get a 0.1% or 0.5% or whatever the increase is better than someone else because I showed up better on Wednesday. We don't translate it that way. What we really care about are the intrinsic things that we talked about earlier, the purpose, the mastery, being part of something. Extrinsic rewards can work when it's very hard coded, like in a sales environment. You do X, you get Y. That will motivate someone. But for most professionals, for most salaried individuals, they're not looking at their annual compensation increase and making a judgment on their performance on how much they're going to weigh in because they think it's going to have an impact.
So people just need to figure out what motivates people and what typically, let's recap. You said at the beginning, but let's recap now. What are the motivations for people now that we've talked about all these fatal flaws and some of the issues?
Yeah, so I talked about the idea of purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And when you translate that into performance management, into conversations about career development, it really is having a strong connection to where we're going as an organization. So is your performance management process connecting you to the organization's strategy and direction? It is about my career and my development. And so are you having strong development conversations that are helping people realize what they're great at, where they could provide, give more value, how they could build onto that, and how you can help them grow in their capabilities and their strengths. And then finally, we do need to reward people, but we need to recognize that often rewards aren't always that, a 1% more increase in your base comp, but they may be the great project that you got, or I got to go on a field assignment into a location that I would never have had that experience to do. We need to think of total rewards in a much more holistic way, but tied back to those ideas of motivation.
You have another topic that you talk about with work culture where, and this happens a lot in today's age, where the need to know concept is out there. Like if you don't need to know, they don't tell you, thinking that, the strategy thing or numbers. How does that kill participation? And is it sometimes healthy for need to know to exist?
I'm probably on the extreme of I think that the more information you can share with people, the better. I think that to try to figure out what information is valuable to one person or another is a very difficult thing to do. And too often, if we go towards we share less versus more, that gets us in trouble because people will fill in the blanks on stuff that they don't know. right? Or they'll make bad assumptions based on what they don't know, or they'll become suspicious and distrustful because you're not sharing information with them. And I think
or they're more important than we are kind of concept.
Yeah,
just kills it.
Totally. And, the more information people have, I mean, I believe a lot in people, and I think the more information they have, the better the insights that they can bring. And you may get value from a corner you never expected when someone